I can't believe that right now I'm doing all this HDMI capture from my Switch onto a tiny external HDMI video capture device that cost me less than $20. I really should have started doing this years ago. Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild was first released back in March of 2017, and it's my first Switch game, not to mention my first console game in about 5 years. That's kind of fitting because I've been approximately 5 years behind on video games my entire life. One of the benefits of being behind on video games your whole life is that they tend to be a lot cheaper, but this time around, 4 years later, this game was still pretty damn expensive, and perhaps that's a consequence of this game being sold on an online platform in an electronic format, which is a first for me, but I guess this has been around for quite a few years now. This is the third Zelda game I've played to completion. My first was Link to the Past back in the 90s, and then I played the Ocarina of Time on an emulator back in 2013. Some say that Okami is basically a Zelda game, so maybe you can say I've completed 4. I've also played a little bit of Majora's Mask, but got bored. There were also a bunch of NES-era Zelda games that I played on emulators as well, but I got bored with those too. I mean, if I'm gonna play a Zelda-style NES-era game, I may as well just replay Crystallis. Anyway, let's get talking about Breath of the Wild. What does this title even mean? Well, Breath of the Wild, it sounds like you're living off the land, traversing the wilderness, and all of that makes sense because I think I only stayed at an inn once in this whole game, just as part of a side quest. There are some other titles they could have gone with, for example, Legend of Zelda: A Tale of Memories, Legend of Zelda: Revenge of the Cloister of Trials, Legend of Zelda: Briefly in the Shadow of the Colossus. Those last two titles, by the way, are callbacks to the video I made about halfway through Breath of the Wild when I basically said that this game was a combination of the most boring parts of Shadow of the Colossus and the most boring parts of Final Fantasy X. Of course, I recommend that you go back and watch that video for the full story, but to sum it up, you're spending a lot of this game running around the world map, not fighting the giants, and when you're not roaming around, you're probably trying to solve a whole bunch of mildly frustrating puzzle games. Most of my opinions from the previous video still stand, however the one thing that really did improve is that I got to fight more. This was a result of powering up my armor and weapons as well as getting used to the battle system. For example, I got much more comfortable with the timing of my counters. Still, your weapons break way too easily and your inventory pouch never seems to be big enough. Even towards the end of the game, it was tough to fight against multiple remotely strong enemies, and brute force, forget about it, that is an untenable strategy no matter where you go or what you do. That unfortunately seems to be the trend these days, using brains above brawn, sneaking around, winning without toxic masculinity. And that's really a shame because this game has a really good battle system. It is my single favorite part of the game. Everything else was fine, but it doesn't really stand out. The music, for example, it's suitable, but how much do you really remember? The only song that really got stuck in my head was the Gollum song. The story was perfectly fine, and it was well done for what it was, but there was nothing ambitious about it. This is consistent with every other Zelda game I've played. You're not going to get a Final Fantasy tier complex story, but that was never Zelda's style. Visually, once again, Zelda does just fine, although there's nothing super impressive about it. I mean, Zelda has never gone for a really realistic style, it's always been kind of cartoonish, and so you don't need the latest greatest graphics to get things done, although if you look back to the Ocarina of Time, yeah, that game really tried to show off its 3D graphics. As I promised in my halfway review, I beat this game without using a strategy guide, and what you see on screen right now is me just cleaning up on some of the side quests that I either couldn't figure out on my own or never even discovered existed. This game has a huge world map, and unless you really comb over every single square foot of land or water for that matter, there's no way that you can get everything done, and I'd given up on being a completionist a very long time ago. I'd estimate that I finished about 70 to 80% of the game at the time I took on the final boss. Now, I was able to take down the final boss in one try, however, I used up pretty much all of my really good food while doing it, and I guess that's one of the benefits of this game. You can really tune it to your own difficulty level. For example, if there's this one boss that you're having a really hard time with, you can just prepare a lot of food beforehand, and when you get into that battle, you can just keep on eating until you finally pull off the victory. On the other hand, if you want to make the game more difficult, you can just not prepare any food, you can turn off all of the protections that you got from your allies, you can use crappy armor and weapons, and this game is basically open world, so you can just skip ahead to the harder parts whenever you want. Another really beautiful thing about this game is that from the very beginning, you can teleport at almost any time or place, so if you get into a situation that's a little too difficult for you, you can back out really easily. Finally, I'd like to comment on the Japanese level of this game. This is actually the first video game that I've completed entirely in Japanese, and for the most part, it's not that bad. The most difficulty you're going to run into is that some of the characters speak with really weird accents. Also, the bird with the accordion who sings the riddle songs, he does use some difficult language, but somehow or another, you can piece things together just by looking around the environment. Anyway, I'd give this game a final grade of a single plus. It is a fun game, and there are some excellent moments. However, those excellent moments are few and far between, and for the most part, you're roaming around, you're doing side quests, you're working your way through the wilderness, and while that's not necessarily boring, at best it's good, not great. Sometimes I'd even be listening to podcasts or audiobooks while working my way through the world. Basically, in a typical moment of gameplay, you're not getting the best that the game has to offer. So while this game is still a good addition to the Legend of Zelda franchise, my favorite is still Link to the Past for the Super Nintendo. Anyway, I'm planning to do just a little more side questing before I'm officially done with this game, and after that, I'll check the price of Mario Odyssey. If it's still really expensive, then I'll probably go with the BioShock trilogy next.